Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Brazilians fear the next president can't save the economy. Find out what that means for the rest of Latin America. Also this week, drugs and money, why the world's big pharmaceutical companies charge such high prices for life-saving pills. Plus, a new minimum wage at e-tailer Amazon, but some say the trillion-dollar company must do better. Now, when the National Museum of Brazil tragically went up in flames last month, many saw it as a metaphor for their own struggles. This is a country where there's widespread unhappiness at the deteriorating quality of life. Inequality is one of the problems. Brazil's 6 richest men have the same wealth as the poorest 50% of the population. That's around 100 million people, according to Oxfam International. Rampant corruption is another issue. A multi-billion-dollar bribery probe called Lava Jato, or car wash, highlighted the kind of special treatment given to the few. Reform is now needed to bring down debt, to tackle violence and fix the unjust public sector pension system. Civil servants often retire in their early 50s on full pay, yet those born in favelas are without access to basic services. Al Jazeera's Lucia Newman has this report from northeastern Brazil.
65-year-old Maria Neusa da Silva can't read or write, or even sign her name. But what she does know is how to work.
I
started working in the tobacco fields when I was 9. My father had died, and my mother couldn't make ends meet.
The story is repeated in the nearby sugar fields. Generation after generation, men work under the merciless sun of northeastern Alagoas state.
I started when I was 10. I'm 44 now. I couldn't find any better job. My father did the same. We never went to school, but my son does. I hope he'll be able to get a better job, because this is no way to live.
Northeastern Brazil is heavily populated, which makes it a magnet for politicians seeking election. In this slum, there's no sewerage, running water, or other basic services. 60% of the people here in Alagoas live in poverty. Their needs are so great and their pockets so empty that they are easy prey during election time for politicians that can come here and buy their votes for as little as $10. Wilton Vieira is a Catholic deacon who works in this slum appropriately named after the Virgin of the Poor. 70% of residents are illiterate.
Of course, if I'm a politician and I give culture and education to people, I'm empowering them. And if I'm empowering them, they may not vote for me. So that's why it's in their interest to keep things as they are, because then they can just keep coming back here at election time with empty promises that people grasp onto.
In the Northeast, as in the rest of Brazil, blacks and mixed race are the most disenfranchised. It's a vicious circle of inequality, aggravated by a severe recession and government austerity that's left 13 million Brazilians unemployed, and even more living in extreme poverty. This economist says a chronic structural problem is to blame.
We must establish medium and long-term development goals for our country, investing in infrastructure, health, education and job creation. That requires political coordination that always eludes us, no matter who's in government.
And even if the next government can start the recovery process, those living here at the bottom of the social ladder will be the last to benefit.
Joining us now from London is Edward Glossop. Edward is the Latin America economist at Capital Economics. Edward, good to have you with us on Counting the Cost again. If the incoming administration in Brazil can't fix the system, is this going to lead to a financial crisis?
Well, I think it's probably not going to lead to a financial crisis. I mean, I think obviously Argentina's fiscal crisis is much more acute because the government has large FX debts. But in Brazil's case, a lot of the government's debt is held in local currencies, which really limits the risks.
You talk about Argentina's economy, the problems there. How important, though, is Brazil to Latin America's economy and even to the global economy?
Well, it's by far the biggest country in the region. But I think it's worth noting, actually, that Brazil is fundamentally quite a closed economy. So it's worth noting that the rest of the region can still do relatively well in terms of economic growth, even if Brazil is stuck in a slump.
Right, so what needs to be done to put Brazil's economy back on track?
Well, I think the main thing that investors are looking for is pension reform and deep fiscal reform. I think there needs to be a big pension reform that President Temer struggled to push through. And I think future governments will struggle to push this through too, because it's highly unpopular with the electorate. And also the reform requires a 3/5 majority in Congress. And Brazil's Congress is massively fragmented. There's 28 political parties in there. It's going to be very difficult to push that kind of unpopular reform through Congress.
OK, so if they can't get pension reform, what else can they get through?
Well, they can probably get through some spending cuts, which will help to narrow the budget deficit and tide things over, if you like, in the coming years. But sooner or later, you need some structural fiscal reform to really bring in that budget deficit to sustainable levels of 2–3% of GDP. And that looks very unlikely without a crisis further down the line.
Brazil, of course, the world's biggest producer of coffee and sugar. What prospects are there for commodities growth there, helping the Brazilian economy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think Brazil is fundamentally a commodity producer, but obviously agricultural prices will play a key role in determining Brazil's terms of trade, which therefore plays a big role in how well the economy is doing overall in terms of its domestic demand. And at Capital Economics, we probably see commodity prices falling back a bit from here, which will probably filter through into weaker growth in Brazil over the coming years. It'll be an added headwind, not just for Brazil, but for the rest of the economy, for the region too, because Latin America is highly dependent on commodities.
And given the almost universal ownership of mobile phones, the use of digital technology, Facebook and Twitter, can the digital economy in Brazil help to bring it to pull it out of recession?
Possibly. I mean, it seems very unlikely. I think what we see in places like Brazil is that things like the digital economy are very much will play in future a much bigger role in places like China, in Asia, where, as I said before, investment rates are very high. So these economies are better placed to actually invest in this new technology, in the digital economy, which can therefore help these economies to produce stronger growth. In places like Brazil, you really need to get that overall economy investment rate up in order to really reap the fruits of the digital economy. And with things like the business environment is still quite bad, and the pension system is very generous, which means that domestic savings are very low. There's no incentive to save domestically, and therefore the investment rate in the economy is too low. So I think the digital economy will obviously grow in importance in Brazil, but it's not going to be a key driver of growth anytime soon. All
right, here's the rub. As a Latin America economist, are you optimistic about the prospects for Brazil in the short to medium term?
Over the next year, I think the cyclical recovery probably has further to run. I mean, we look at the business and consumer confidence indicators, they're still pointing upwards, and that should help domestic demand to stay strong over the next 3 to 6 months or so. Beyond that, I would say we're probably more bearish than most on the prospects. Potential growth is probably around 2%, which is very weak for an emerging market of Brazil's size and at Brazil's income level.
Edward, good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Well, as you're hearing there, Brazilians are pretty active on social media. Brazil is Facebook's third biggest market. WhatsApp says it has 120 million users in a country of 200 million people. Online platforms keen to protect themselves have stepped up deletion of fake accounts in Brazil. Bots are computer programs which can be automated to carry out tasks. We use them in search engines, but they're also used to spread false information and to mimic human users online. Analysts say that the 2018 election in Brazil will be an important reference point for the country and its relationship with social media. Still to come on Counting the Cost, the taxman cometh. Find out what a Chinese film star called Fan Bingbing and US President Donald Trump have in common. But first, one of America's largest employers is raising pay for its workers. Amazon says its workers in the US will be paid a minimum of $15 an hour from next month, and workers in the UK will also get a raise. Now, in the past, the company's been criticised for its labour practices, including underpaying workers. Paddy Culhane reports.
America has a problem. The divide between those with the least and those with the most is growing, and the gap is just getting wider. The economy is doing well, but wages are not rising. That statistic might soon see a bump. One of America's largest employers, Amazon, has announced that everyone who helps send these smiling boxes around the country will soon be paid more, at a minimum $15 an hour, more than double the national minimum wage.
It's not cheap. It's going to cost them $1 billion, I think, per year. It's not that they're able to raise prices or pass that through to customers. This is something their shareholders are going to fund. But I think that a lot of Amazon shareholders think this is the right thing to do.
That's what Amazon said was behind the move. It was the right thing to do. But it's also facing a lot of criticism, in large part because of its founder, Jeff Bezos. He is the richest man in the world, worth $165 billion. Breaking that down, he makes about $275 million each and every day. And Amazon is hugely profitable. In the second quarter of this year, it had a profit of $2.5 billion. So it can afford the raises. And with low unemployment, it might have to pay more to get in enough workers to move their merchandise. Still, the raise is being praised by Amazon's toughest critics.
What Mr. Bezos today has done is not only enormously important for Amazon's hundreds of thousands of employees, it could well be, and I think it will be, a shot heard around the world.
Not every economist thinks paying workers more will actually help decrease income inequality.
On the one hand, yes, workers in Amazon will benefit from this increase in basic pay, but in the longer term, Amazon is exactly the type of company which we'd imagine would invest in automation, and it'd be much more difficult for other companies, traditional retailers, to match this kind of offer.
America can often seem like two different countries, divided between the haves and have-nots. Economists will be watching to see if Amazon's move does anything to heal the divide.
Now to the Middle East, where Yemen's southern separatists have called for more demonstrations over the collapse of the country's currency. The Southern Transitional Council is piling the pressure on President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi. They blame him for the economic collapse after a 4-year war with Houthi rebels. Al Jazeera's Bernard Smith reports now from Djibouti.
Economic collapse, rather than the war against the Houthis, is now becoming the biggest short-term threat to the stability of Yemen's government. Across the south, there have been protests against the fall in the value of the currency.
Saudi's war on Yemen is seriously affecting us. We've not been paid properly for the last 3 years. We can't find any other way to get by.
Diesel is up to $18 for 20 litres when it was $9 before. Cooking gas is $9 for a canister and is impossible to find. The only fuel you can get is on the black market.
The government had been printing more money to try and keep cash flowing, but there's been no increase in exports and not enough foreign currency reserves to support the increased supply. Now the Saudi Arabian government has given the central bank $200 million to stabilize the rial.
When you print more money, it must be matched by hard currencies in the market. If you don't, it does nothing to help the value of our damaged currency. And the siege imposed on Yemen, preventing exports from liberated provinces, also damages the economy. These government failures have caused an economic collapse.
These protests seem to have been spontaneous, but now the leadership of the Southern Transition Council, the STC, is organising more demonstrations. For 4 years, a Saudi-UAE coalition supporting the internationally recognised government of President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi has been fighting Houthi rebels. But the STC, backed by the UAE, wants independence for southern Yemen. That's rejected by President Hadi. Against this backdrop of growing protests, the UN's Special Envoy for Yemen has arrived in Abu Dhabi. Martin Griffiths is trying to arrange talks between the Yemeni government and the Houthis. The separatist leader, Idris al-Zubaydi, is also there, and if there are any talks, he also wants a seat at the table.
Drug company Nostrum Pharmaceuticals has hiked the price of a 65-year-old antibiotic mixture by up to 400% to $2,000 a bottle. Nostrum's wasn't the only price hike last month. It was one of 60, according to analysts at Wells Fargo. Drug price hikes of essential medicines are coming under political scrutiny from China to the US. Remember Pharma Bro? Martin Shkreli, or Pharma Bro, became infamous back in 2015. The former CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals raised the price of an AIDS drug from $13.50 to $750 a tablet, sparking a huge backlash. The reality is that drug makers can boost prices so that they and middlemen can make bigger profits. Well, developing a drug is estimated to cost around $2 billion, but with advances in artificial intelligence, some are saying that those metrics could change. And should the consumer really have to pay those costs? Well, the most expensive drugs are those that treat the rarer diseases. In the UK, NHS spending on drugs is rising at 5 times the rate of its budget, according to the King's Fund think tank. The cost of cancer drugs in China was highlighted recently by the Chinese film Dying to Survive. And it's becoming a political issue too in the US, with President Donald Trump putting pressure on companies like Pfizer to lower prices for life-saving prescription drugs. Joining us now from London is Gustav Ando. Gustav's a Senior Director and Vice President within the Life Sciences Group at IHS Markit. Good to have you with us. Who decides on the pricing of a new drug? Is there a world body that decides what's fair and what isn't?
No, very good question. No, not really, no. So it really depends on the country that you're talking about. Each country has its own healthcare system, its own healthcare budget, and by extension, its own system of charging or deciding on what a new treatment should be priced at and what is a fair level. So in many countries, it's a very heavily regulated market and very difficult to charge, I guess, what you would call excessive prices. But then other markets have a very different healthcare system, and they let the free market decide a little bit more how or what a fair price for this system is. And in which case there's a multiple layers of actors who decide on the price, starting with the pharmaceutical company itself, proposing a price and then having payers, insurance companies, and other bodies that can then weigh in to decide whether this is actually a fair price or not. And then there can be a negotiation based on that.
Can you give us any specific examples where that actually happens?
Sure. I don't want it to become maybe too UK-centric, but for example, in the UK, there is a very lengthy process. Although actually the government has ensured to try to quicken that process, and actually some of the recent new innovative treatments have come to the UK a little bit quicker than usual. But there's sort of a to and fro discussion between the pharmaceutical company on the one hand, who have also been developing this treatment for, let's say, 10 years or 5 years. And conducted multiple clinical trials, and many drugs have failed along the way to be able to get to this potentially one successful one. And they have an idea of what they think the price of the treatment should be. But then the government, obviously, on the other hand, has its budget that it needs to weigh up against, and has its own system and its own mechanism to decide on what a fair price for the treatment should be. And very often there's actually an initial rejection of the price, and they go back to the drawing board and they have more discussions, and then ultimately they hopefully will reach an agreement on what is a fair treatment or what is a fair price for this treatment.
How is the big disruptor digitalization affecting big pharma, with people taking more control better control of their lives, with computers now able to predict perhaps people's chances of succumbing to certain illnesses or conditions? Shouldn't digitization mean the price of medicines going down and not up in the future?
Yes and no. I mean, it really depends on what angle that you're looking at. Digitalization for sure changes almost everything within healthcare. It means that you're able to conduct potentially more efficient clinical trials. You're able to more easily identify potential molecules that you can target and mechanisms of action that you can target. So, and then all the way through to the actual delivery mechanism of a treatment. So you actually have digital tablets now, for example, for certain for certain treatments. So there's a couple of things that you need to look at, though, over what then results in the final price of the drug, and that can be the level of innovation that this is actually bringing to treatments. Potentially, digitalization has a very, very strong ability to enable clients to adhere to their medications, but through digital technology, that there are apps out there and other technologies that help you and remind you that you need to be taking your medication right now. And there's obviously enormous value in able to be able to do that, that can be reflected in the final price of a treatment as well.
So tech companies will be the driving force of digitalization in the pharma industry. These companies, like all tech companies, are going to own data, lots of data on therapies, on patients and research. Sure. Should we, as consumers, trust them?
Well, we already do to an extent. This is very, very sensitive data, clearly, and again, the healthcare and pharmaceutical sector has extremely strict privacy guarantees around this. So, in order to enter this market or in order to be able to provide technology for this, you have to sign up to some of the most strict privacy laws that are possible in this case. So it's a trade-off for sure, but it always is. As soon as you're taking a medication or as soon as you're even visiting a doctor, you are talking about an illness, and there may be underlying symptoms there that are either obvious or not obvious, and it's always a trade-off, or it's a contract almost between yourself and the data that you're sharing with whoever you're talking to in this case. And this is just a new avenue for that, and for sure, clearly there needs to be strict monitoring of it, and there already is in most countries around the world. This is quite a new area, and so. There are definitely reforms taking place and regulatory clampdowns to make sure that there is protection in place for patients and consumers.
Good stuff. Great to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you so much.
Now, what is it they say? There are only two certainties in life: death and taxes. This week, the New York Times reported on how US President Donald Trump allegedly exploited the tax system to make millions. The Trump family's tax affairs are now being reviewed by New York state authorities following the allegations of fraud. Shihab Ratanzi reports.
The New York Times report goes to the heart of the Donald Trump origin story that he would tell on the campaign trail, that he is a self-made man. He used a $1 million loan from his father to make billions of dollars and earn property empire worldwide. The New York Times saying, no, that's not true. He received millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars from his father from a very early age. And indeed, his father would step in when Donald Trump's fabled deal-making would run into problems. So that's one part of this story. The other part is the allegations of illegality, that Trump and his family set up sham corporations, underestimated the value of their property portfolio in order to evade taxes. The criminal liability Trump might face, if these allegations are proven true, has passed. The statute of limitations has passed. However, civil action is possible. New York authorities already launching an investigation. No word from the Inland Revenue Service. The federal authorities, although they're so depleted of funding, you wonder whether they even have the resources to investigate this sort of thing. But Donald Trump's lawyer insisting that this is all false, 100% false, highly defamatory, he says.
Finally, this week, one of China's top actresses has been ordered to pay a $129 million tax bill. The actress has appeared in the X-Men and Iron Man franchises and is the face of luxury brands in China. Our China correspondent Adrian Brown reports.
Well, this is thought to be the biggest ever fine imposed on a Chinese movie star. 892 million RMB, that's almost 130 million US dollars. That's what the tax authorities say Fan Bingbing owes them. They say if she pays this money back, she will not face criminal prosecution. Fan Bingbing says she hopes to be able to do just that. Now, Fan Bingbing is not the best-known actress here in China, but she's certainly one of the best paid, earning some $43 million last year. She vanished from public view in June, and nothing had been heard of her until now. She has issued a statement on Weibo, which is China's equivalent of Twitter. She says that she's been experiencing unprecedented suffering. I'm ashamed of what I've done, and she apologized to her many fans. Now, it could well be that the Chinese authorities who've been investigating other stars are sending out a warning that this is what could happen to other celebrities who avoid paying tax. It seems that in the case of Fan Bingbing, she had been understating what she was paid in her contract, and the authorities seem to say this has become part of a widespread trend that they're determined to deal with.
And that's our show for this week. If there's anything you've seen that you'd like to comment on, you can get in touch with us. You can tweet me. I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. There is, as always, plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that's where we end this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.